All right, thanks for having me. I'm Kristin, the Climate Resilience Planner with the City of Baltimore. Basically going to go through a little bit of the background in Baltimore real quick. I know we don't need to go into what we're experiencing, but I think it's important for a little bit of context. Some of the planning we've been doing, and then also some implementation around the concept of resiliency and how we're connecting that with a lot of different initiatives in the city, some of our ongoing projects, and then maybe we'll get to some partnerships. But just for some context, for those of you who are not from the United States or maybe don't know where Baltimore is, we're the one that falls in between Washington, D.C. and New York City. It's the place that people usually drive through on the way. And we are at the top of the Chesapeake Bay. So we get water that comes up from the ocean and kind of compresses up there at the top of the bay. We're also at the base of 4 major watersheds, which is really important because we're getting water from both sides, all angles, all around. That's impacting a lot of what's happening with our city and a lot of what's happening with precipitation change and obviously sea level rise. We've experienced some really big shocks. We like to be in the news a lot, really get out there. So in the upper left-hand corner, if you remember last April, we had the landslide that the retaining wall fell right on top of the CSX rail line. We also had some pretty big infrastructure failure, issues with urban karsts or sinkholes where entire city streets fall away, and then some massive flooding and poor decision making by a lot of our residents to try to drive through areas as you see in the middle down there. We also, just for some context, we took an all hazards approach, so all the hazards that we assessed, basically the biggest thing for us is to just make note that they're more severe, more intense, and that's kind of why we need to be focusing a lot on connecting with resiliency, all the work that we're doing around climate and climate change. It might have gone too fast there. Stresses, also very, very big, and I think it was mentioned in the previous talk, but we're dealing with a lot of the impacts from institutional racism for a long period of time. A lot of issues here. The blue, and just in case you can see it, dark blue is our African American population. Income, so our lowest income is the lighter yellow there, and then unemployment in the darker red. And you can see how those are pretty heavily overlapped in Baltimore City. I'm not sure why that's not working, but we'll try again. All right, and we're also dealing with some other big issues. So since we had the riots this past year, or the civil unrest, obviously there's a lot happening around racism and the history that we've had in Baltimore. But we also have a lot of issues with epidemic drug use and homicides, and the murder rate in our city. We've exceeded it pretty bad this year. So a lot of big stresses and shocks coming together. Obviously those shocks are going to exacerbate our stresses, but things that we're trying to bring together in a lot of the planning we're doing around resiliency. So to come into the work that we're doing around planning, in that we took a FEMA required all hazard mitigation approach and decided to kind of turn it upside down and say we don't really agree with much of the way it's structured, but we want to meet the criteria of having our all hazard plan, but also incorporate looking forward instead of just looking back. So we went through the risk assessment process, really looking at identifying our hazards, thinking about this historical context, but also doing a lot of modeling and looking at looking forward, what we're anticipating seeing, what are going to be the impacts moving forward. And really trying to consider that from the overlap of the economic, social, and environmental and legal consequences associated. We have, with a lot of these types of plans, they're focused by hazards, so by heat or sea level rise. For us, that's not how we implement things on the ground. We don't have the Department of Sea Level Rise, we don't have the Department of Heat. So we had FEMA as part of the stakeholder in this process and said, we really want to change the structure of this plan. We need to do it in a way that makes sense for us to move forward in implementation right away. So we went into infrastructure, buildings, natural systems, and public services. So it was easier for us to bring together our stakeholders, to create bigger sub kind of commissions and groups to help us, and also to align with the way that we were implementing things in our different city departments. In that, we've created a plan called the Disaster Preparedness Plan. It's a combined all hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. I could go into this for a full hour. I won't, but if you want any more information about it, I'm happy to share it with you. What we did do is have a massive advisory committee as part of putting together this plan with multiple stakeholders. We got capped at 40, so then we decided to create other subcommittees to make sure that we were getting input from all the different stakeholders that were involved. So we not only had one representative from the port on the actual committee, we then went and met with the port and their environmental committee of 35 people and had them as a subcommittee to developing the plan. We did that with a lot of nonprofit groups, a lot of our private stakeholders, and a lot of our residents and citizens. So we had a lot of community members on the actual advisory committee, but then we went out into the community and worked with people. We did some staff trainings within the city to try to get people really engaged and involved around climate and impacts, but we also went into people's homes. We went to them, we went to places that they felt they could trust and they felt most comfortable. And we also had the bigger town hall events where you bring people in, but we found that we got a lot more rich information and a lot more dialogue and a lot more buy-in from doing the meetings in the community and being in places that people felt most comfortable. In that, we also did something where we recognized that low-income individuals often don't participate in these kind of meetings because not only are they intimidating, but they don't have a way to get there, they don't have a way to get food on the table that night, and they often have children and don't have childcare. So the way that we tried to get people to come to the bigger meetings was we actually provided free transportation. We made the majority of the meetings entirely hands-on with no presentations, so no PowerPoints. Really, putting boards up on the walls, trying to make it more comfortable, and then having a lot more interaction and a lot more staff there to talk with folks, to sit down and have conversations. We did do free food and gave away free information and free emergency kits. But then we also really tried to bring these to trusted spaces, to churches, community centers that were already being used that people felt comfortable in. And that was a huge piece of getting buy-in as part of our plan. We've also been using equity as a lens. So for all of our planning projects, that's kind of an essential piece of work in Baltimore. You can't ignore the fact that we have some big inequities in Baltimore. We see a lot of people talking about equity now and trying to integrate equity. Equity was really the lens in which we look at all of our planning projects, including our sustainability plan, our climate action plan, and our disaster preparedness plan. But we try to provide job training and green jobs and opportunities as a part of all of our different initiatives, and then also trying to highlight the economic and health benefits for folks as we're going through the planning process, but also through the implementation process. So I think the key thing that I was asked to talk a lot about is instead of all the planning, a lot of what we're doing with the implementation and how we've moved forward with implementation. In that, what I found to be kind of the key thing that transitioned from planning to implementation was to go through a big crosswalking process, which is to take all of our 231 actions in that plan and identify where they overlap with existing plans and projects at the city and the state level. It took a very, very long time, but that was also something that we could go to a department or an agency director and say, look, here are your projects that you already have. Here are ways you can incorporate climate or consideration of resiliency, and here's a way to improve it with the next capital improvement process round. So it was a lot of upfront work, but it also opened the door for us to be able to have those conversations because we didn't just send them a spreadsheet and say, here are 231 actions, where do you think you fit in? It was, here's where you already fit in, here are the projects you're already doing, here's how to enhance them or make them better. We also identified in the plan itself connections with some of our bigger things like our emergency support functions and like I mentioned before, our climate action plan. So we're finding the co-benefits between mitigation and adaptation. And that was something that was listed along with our lead agencies and stakeholders on every single page of the plan. For us, prioritization, also really looking at co-benefits. When you're trying to talk in the city about resiliency, we really look a lot at climate mitigation, hazard mitigation, and climate adaptation and bringing them all together under the frame of resiliency or preparedness. And so for us, thinking about these areas where we have a lot of co-benefits and also prioritizing from there where we can get the biggest bang for the buck. So for us, one of the biggest things we started on is called the whole block approach. And that's really considering our areas that have been historically disinvested in, that are somewhere over 80% impervious surface, completely lacking in tree canopy, have not had any investment in the building structures in a long time, and typically are the sources of our biggest infrastructure failures. So trying to bring together a lot of the initiatives I'm going to talk about coming up soon as overlapping them in these neighborhoods and allowing us to hopefully leverage them moving forward. One of the bigger things that we did to start with was working on codes. So Floodplain Code and thinking about resiliency with buildings in the floodplain. What the city of Baltimore did was adopt a 2-foot freeboard, which the state and the federal government hadn't done at that point, so we kind of led the way. But we also decided to expand the extent of our floodplain to the 500-year floodplain line. So instead of the 100-year, we now regulate to the extent of the 500-year. In the coastal floodplain, we also regulate to the height of the 500-year floodplain. What this means is it's a big change for systems and how we use these first floors. Thinking about parking, no more underground parking, changing where we're having our mechanical systems, access to buildings, things like that. We also looked at codes as far as building codes and recently adopted the International Green Construction Code, which really has a mandate for renewable energy systems, which is wonderful for us. There's a part for sustainability, which is really thinking about building materials and how building materials are used and recycled, but also for us thinking about renewable energy systems and encouraging kind of battery backup as that goes through. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go really fast. But with energy, we're doing a lot of focus in low-income areas. So doing weatherization, cool roof installation, and solar panel, like I mentioned, connecting that with jobs and local jobs in the communities. Working a lot with our private partners, but also focusing a lot on our critical facilities and getting solar and battery backup systems at our critical facilities along with with backup generators. We're also doing a big thing to build off of energy, which is working on resiliency hubs. And these are in areas that are most vulnerable to the impacts, usually our low-income and African-American communities, where we are piloting 4 resiliency hubs that are going to be central locations where people can walk to and access food, water, supplies. We're connecting it with our community emergency response team members, but we're also going to have deployment of emergency responders there, healthcare professionals, and access for people to just come and charge cell phones if power is out. These are buildings that we're going to retrofit to be able to not necessarily be shelters, but be locations that people can go in the event of an emergency or long-term disturbance. This is building off of a lot of the work that we're doing in the community. One of the biggest projects we have going on right now is called Make a Plan, Build a Kit, Help Each Other. It's focused on preparedness and building community adaptive capacity. So instead of coming in and giving people a kit and giving them an emergency plan and saying, here, this is what you need, we actually sit down with them for about an hour and a half and we work through creating their emergency plans with them. We look at where their emergency shelters are. We identify their evacuation routes, their out-of-area contacts. We actually do asset mapping to identify what assets they have in the community and what shortcomings. And then we actually build the kits with them to make sure they know exactly how to use the kits and the materials in those kits. We're also using green infrastructure and overlapping a lot of the work we're doing with green infrastructure with this work. I'm going to kind of go through it quickly because I don't have a lot of time, but we're using it as a way to provide economic, environmental, and social benefits in the city by thinking about reinvestment, but also prioritizing those areas that have been historically disinvested. This is called the Growing Green Initiative. We actually have over 16,000 vacant properties in Baltimore City. We're trying to use those as assets now instead of considering them as shortcomings. Thinking about how the community can be involved in designing how we reuse those vacant lots. I'm going to skip this one, but we have a cool database of trees, if anybody's interested, that integrates all the climate impacts we're going to see. We've also been putting in heat island sensors. So like I mentioned, we're doing the whole block approach. We've put in heat island sensors on the ground to monitor what the heat feels like on the ground, and then as we go through and implement these changes over time, we're hoping within a certain period of time we're actually able to notice if we're lowering the urban heat islands or having a greater impact. And this is in partnership with Johns Hopkins and the Maryland Institute College of Art. We're also doing a lot around food. Access to food is a huge thing, especially in our areas. I brought up the other maps, but you can see our food deserts are pretty overlapped with our areas that are lowest income and also primarily African American. So we've been focusing a lot on doing food access initiatives, virtual supermarkets, healthy food in stores, and also thinking about healthy carryouts. We're also doing a lot around thinking about urban agriculture and trying to enhance that. So we updated our city's animal code and created a soil safety policy and passed an urban agriculture tax credit to get more of those urban farms into areas and into communities that have issues with access to food. We're thinking a lot about food as far as resiliency, and we have an emergency task force for food because one of the biggest things with the riots was actually that people didn't have access to food. And the mayor's office was more focused on getting food to the responders rather than recognizing that the community actually needed food as well. So now there's an emergency task force that we're starting our first meeting next week to think about not only emergency food, but food and kind of food resiliency in the long term. Doing a lot of focus on critical facilities. I'm not going to go into it, but also connecting that with response and recovery. A lot of stuff that we're doing with Afteraction reporting and trying to make sure that communities are involved in Afteraction reporting, so that guides what we're doing with planning moving forward. We're building a lot on our community emergency response teams and trying to have them help us with identifying issues from flooding and other issues around the communities, and thus coordinating a lot with the Office of Emergency Management around public safety initiatives to make sure that all of our work is kind of connected and coming together. And then schools. Schools is a big piece. I think integrating all of this work into schools is a huge element in how we're getting kids involved. I will say one of the bigger pieces and one of the biggest successes we've had is actually integrating resiliency, or the concept of resiliency and climate adaptation, into our capital improvements process. Because the Department of Planning manages the capital improvements process, it means that I get to be part of it, which is great. And we created a resiliency checklist that folks have to go through and identify how their project will adapt to natural hazards in the future that we've identified through the DP3, and also make ties to anticipated impacts from climate change. So like I said, we probably won't get to partners, but some of the new work we're doing right now, things we're working on right now, is creating trainings for all city staff, our stakeholders, and also our ambassadors, going into very, very specific sectors. So not just a climate change 101, but doing a basic training and then going more into depth. We are going to have a shift in our administration very soon. And so in that, trying to develop these trainings so that as soon as the new administration comes in, this is something we can make a priority by providing that training up front. We're doing a lot of work on historic properties, especially in the floodplain, and thinking about retrofitting historic properties and coming up with specific materials, which hasn't been done yet because FEMA exempts historic properties from floodplain management. And then also looking at a curriculum development. And I think that's all I have time for.
Okay, thanks, Kristin.
Wow.
So we'll just take a few quick questions. If I may, I'll take the first question because I've really admired the DP3 as a wonderful example of an adaptation plan, and there is a whole chapter on metrics, performance metrics, to evaluate what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you see the metrics that are there, which are largely performance metrics, do they communicate to you or to the city government or to the community whether or not the city is more resilient or less resilient?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. It's a good question. I think when we were originally coming up with the metrics, we were trying to think how can we track success in this. We're working on, I think, enhancing those metrics right now to think about how can we actually prove that we're enhancing resiliency or strengthening community adaptive capacity. Some of the things are really hard to track, like whether or not people are using the emergency kits and plans in the event of emergency. We keep track of all the folks who have come to the meetings, and we try to continue to do outreach, and we're continuing following up with them. I do know that during the riots, we had a lot of people who said that they use those materials and that it was really great to have. But I think we're still in the process of identifying really good metrics for success around resiliency, and that's something I'm working actually with a couple other cities on right now through the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. Mm-hmm. And also we're kind of testing out and we're seeing how it goes. Some things end up being really good indicators for us, and other ones we're like, why did we even think that was a good idea?
Yeah, okay. So we'll have time for two questions, Lisa and Adam, and then we'll switch out and have more time after Dale.
I stayed a great place, actually, and I think Baltimore, apart from all the murders, it sounds like an amazing place.
It is. You should definitely come visit. It's great.
But I was just wondering how, when you talk about communities, what exactly are you referring to? Because it's one city, so is it neighborhoods, or are you talking about income groups, or what?
Baltimore has over 256 distinct neighborhoods, self-identified neighborhoods. So we work with those self-identified neighborhoods and the self-identified neighborhood associations or groups or community leaders to try to make sure that we're communicating with as many residents, citizens, business owners as possible. We obviously use, I think, some of our bigger associations or groups to reach out to small businesses or larger waterfront businesses. But when it comes to citizen outreach, we have an ambassador program. We have energy ambassadors, climate ambassadors, trash ambassadors. So we're trying to bring those all together now into one kind of comprehensive ambassador group. But they're really the outlets for us to get on the ground working with people who look at me and say, you don't know, you're not from here and you don't look like me and I don't want to listen to anything you're saying. And so it's kind of a good way of collaboration for us to go with somebody that they know and trust and have that dialogue, usually in a group size about this size.
Okay, Adam and Dale, you can come up if you'd like. We're switching out.
Kristin, fantastic presentation. I wish we can get your slides if you don't mind.
Yeah, they're up there.
It's just hard. It's like there's so much to get. Question related to, in a way, James's question. Was there a point when you're developing the plan where you had sort of, for the different strategies, you had a sense of, you and the staff within the office had a sense of, this is the outcome we're trying to achieve, and for either groupings of strategies or individual strategies?
Yeah, the way it's structured is we had 6 major goals, 50 strategies, and then 231 actions. And the actions help us achieve, the strategies are the objectives that connect to each goal. And those are identified in the plan, so the goal that it's actually pertaining to, and then the strategy and the actions are listed under those. What we try to do is we met way more than I think most advisory groups do. And the idea was to not only create really strong actions for moving forward, but also create strong metrics or indicators for success as part of that. So identifying with folks in the moment, how would this be successful? What would be success for you? And do we have funding to implement it now? What is the time frame? Trying to consider all of those elements. And that was helpful also in identifying the overlap with existing plans and projects. Again, I think we weren't as strong in metrics as I would have liked. We had 1 year to complete all of this because it was a funded opportunity, a pre-disaster mitigation grant. Now that we're going to have, I think, more opportunity to look at it and we're diving deeper into metrics, I think we're looking to enhance those and make them stronger. And I'm happy to share any of that information with folks as we move forward.